What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and gather round, children, gather round. Let Papa Rob teach you about Blade. Here's the funny thing, right? I'm doing this because hopefully they're going to drop some information about Blade at San Diego, which is going to drive up interest and people will watch this video. If that doesn't happen, this video is probably going to flop. I don't know. We'll find out. But if you really want me to blow your mind, and we're going to talk about this later, Blade did not become a Daywalker in Marvel Comics until after the Blade movie was released in 1999. I know. Crazy, right? So check this out. So Blade originally appeared in Marvel Comics back in Tomb of Dracula issue number 10 in 1973, and he was created by Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan. Now, an important thing to understand here is that Blade was very similar to Luke Cage insofar that he was Marvel's attempt to capitalize on the existing blaxploitation movement taking place in Hollywood, which is to say the desire of Marvel Comics to bring in black audiences by basically creating characters that were black themselves and usually playing some kind of a heroic role. The funny thing about this is that there was an interview that was done by Gene Colan back in 2003 in Tomorrow's Publishing where he was talking about the creation of Blade and saying and really seeming to illustrate this idea that Marv Wolfman, of course, said Blade needs to be a black guy. And the creation of him as we saw him at that point in time really seemed to be a tried and true collaboration between both Gene Colan and Marv Wolfman, which in reality was something that happened very rarely in the 60s and 70s in Marvel Comics. More often what you would find is you would find like a person would create something and then they would say they're the ones that created everything, as opposed to it actually being the writer and artist both who essentially worked on it. But the thing about this, and what's really going to strike you as being fascinating here, is the way Blade was depicted in the early Tomb of Dracula stories and really running all the way up until he reappeared in 1984. It doesn't really look anything like the Blade that you know. And in fact, he was depicted the way you saw fashion and characters depicted back during that point in time. The only real thing we had about him is that he just kind of appeared in Tomb of Dracula issue number 10, faced off against Dracula, and then appeared over the course of that comic. So between 1973 and 1974, he appeared in issues 10, 12, 13, 14, 17 through 19, 21, 24, and 30. So he was just kind of like an off-again, on-again villain of Dracula that would just show up at differing points in time. Now, the reality here was that over the course of 1973 going into 1974, Blade was actually gaining popularity. He was gaining a lot of interest among comic book readers because he was just so different. You know, the truth about Tomb of Dracula is that in a lot of ways, it wasn't so much a holdover of Marvel Publishing when they were Atlas Comics publishing science fiction stories, but it was the desire of Marvel as they were publishing at the time to see if it was marketable to bring back the horror element, at least in some kind of a comic, and see if it would stick, and it did. The Tomb of Dracula comic is considered one of the best comic runs that Marvel had in relation to the character of Dracula, and in fact, because of that comic, Dracula has stayed popular in Marvel Comics for decades, right? That run right there is kind of seminal. Now, you may not have heard of it if you're not familiar with Dracula, but for those individuals out there who love the character of Dracula, it's a landmark story, and in fact, one of the most significant stories of Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan. Now, the thing about this is that by the time you got to the 30th issue, that's when Marvel was looking at the idea of doing something a little bit different with his character. And so in issue number 30, what they did is they basically wrote him out of the Dracula stories by basically having a scenario where Blade approached Dracula and then pitched this idea to him that what he wanted to do was essentially serve as Dracula's agent operating out there and really like fast track vampires conquering the world. That what he had done was put out this idea that vampires were going to conquer the world. But what people like Blade could do is they could actually make that happen faster. Of course, Dracula, very much enjoying that idea, ended up accompanying Blade only to be ambushed by Blade and a handful of his allies. Now, this was kind of the extension of the nature of blaxploitation and the building of Blade's entourage as it existed in the time, in the sense that it was largely a black group. So again, Marvel really trying to tie into bringing in black fans at that point in time. So of course, they ended up not really killing Dracula, but kind of overpowering him. He was somewhat left for dead, and then in turn, one of his agents had shown up. They had killed a few members of Blade's group, and then in turn, went forward from there, right? Dracula basically escaped, and then Blade kind of struck out on his own. And that's where the Vampire Tales comics came into play. Now, Vampire's Tales, it was interesting for what it was, but it was basically just a black and white comic at the time. Now, something that I do want to point out about this initiative is Vampire Tales was an incredibly important comic for a couple different reasons, and it wasn't really even a comic, it was a magazine. So the idea, and one of the things we've talked about, was the Comics Code Authority, basically the governing body of comic books. The comics had to follow rules at the time if they wanted to receive the seal of approval from the Comics Code, which for parents, buying comics for their kids was paramount. So think of it as the comic book equivalent of like the movie rating system now, or TV rating systems, video game rating systems, that kind of a thing. And so what this meant was that by publishing Vampire Tales as a magazine under Magazine Management Incorporated, which was actually the owner of Marvel Comics, but not publishing the magazine directly as a Marvel comic itself, it allowed them to circumvent the entirety of the comics code, which basically meant they could have like some mild profanity. I mean, there wasn't really anything outright in terms of like cussing or anything like that. You certainly didn't see anything like you would see in the 2000s with like Jessica Jones and Marvel Max. But at the time in the 1970s, it was pretty intense, right? For like publishing at that point in time, it was a pretty intense comic. But this one in particular set the groundwork for what would become the sort of on-again, off-again ally/friendship of Blade and Michael Morbius. Because while the Vampire Tales stories dealt with Michael Morbius really kind of getting his first quote-unquote solo run and dealing with a woman named Amanda Saint basically having to contend with a demon fire cult, they were quite literally called Demon Fire, that worshipped Lucifer. So those are the kind of stories that you saw in Vampire Tales. His first encounter with Blade in this comic was Blade trying to kill him because he was a vampire. It wasn't until Adventure into Fear, issue number 24 in 1974, that you actually saw Blade and Morbius working together when Blade realized that Morbius was a living vampire and had this kind of personal plight that he had to contend with, right? Like, he didn't want to kill people, but he basically had to feed on the blood of others in order to keep himself alive, but tried to contend with that and tried to make up for those actions by being a superhero whenever he wasn't consuming folks. And just based on that, of course, he and Blade worked together to fight a greater threat, but that set the stage for the relationship between the two, which would become wildly significant not only in the 1990s, but also going into the late 1990s. And so following this, the next major role for Blade came in Marvel Preview issue number 3, and this was particularly important because while Tomb of Dracula issue number 13 gave us kind of an origin, but not really, all it told us is that Blade, basically his mom had died because she was bitten by a vampire when she was in the process of giving birth to him, and that he's really just kind of been on the hunt for his mother's killer ever since, right? That's like his motivation for existing. And that's it. That's all we got in terms of an origin. The funny thing about this is that in issue number 3 of Marvel Preview, this was really one of those instances when Chris Claremont was kind of making a name for himself in Marvel Comics as the guy who could not only tell compelling stories, something that we would see really come to fruition in his landmark run on the X-Men, but also as the guy who could tell stories, really large form origins for individual characters. Now for Blade himself, the story was just kind of a continuation of what we saw in terms of him hunting for his mother's killer. But as far as his origin went, it was actually the most detailed we'd gotten up to that point. And what we found out is that basically his mother was working in a brothel, right? Madame Vanity's brothel, kind of giving, or at least in the process of giving birth there, that the unnamed person that had turned her was simply described in the same way. He hadn't been named Deacon Frost yet. He hadn't actually been given that name per se in Marvel Comics. It was simply just a tall guy with silver hair and glowing eyes that had bit his mother, and that following that, that's where the initial Tomb of Dracula story ended, Chris Claremont continued on by basically saying that at 9 years old, he had experienced kind of an attack that actually turned out to be done by vampires, but he was rescued by a guy named Jamal Afari, who was himself a vampire hunter, and that Jamal Afari had just kicked the drug habit, or at least was in the process of getting rid of it, took Eric Brooks under his wing as the son he never had. Eric Brooks saw him as the father he never had, and as what was in effect father and son, that Jamal taught Eric Brooks everything he needed to know, not only about how to play the jazz trumpet, but also everything he knew about vampires. Now, the caveat to this, and what was so wild about this, is there came a point when Dracula tracked down Jamal and turned him to a vampire. And when that happened, that's when Eric Brooks had to kill his mentor. And that's why Eric Brooks held a very particular hatred towards Dracula himself as a kind of a secondary thing defining his mother's killer, and why he and Dracula had fought so much over the course of the Tomb of Dracula story. But I wanted to wait until this particular point in his publication history to illustrate that this sort of origin and this feud between Dracula and Blade is really the result of retcon in Marvel Comics. It didn't initially start out that way, it was just changed later on. But that's why Marvel Preview Review number 3 is so significant for Blade because where he was a teenager just hunting down vampires and using whatever fighting tactics he had to overcome them, the reality is that he was unpolished, he was untrained. Jamal Afari largely fixed a lot of that, taught him the things he needed to know to be an effective vampire hunter. So in a lot of ways, Dracula had essentially killed the father of Eric Brooks, even if he was not his biological father. And so where Blade was rolled back over into the Tomb of Dracula stories in really in 1975, running all the way up until the series cancellation, that what you found was that aside from Blade helping Dracula defeat a villain named Dr. Sun and then asking Dracula to help him track down the vampire that killed his mother, and of course that being refused and the two of them sort of fighting, there wasn't a whole lot doing with Blade in relation to Dracula. He had some significant moments there, but nothing overly valuable. And in fact, following this in 1977 or following 1977, he actually disappeared from Marvel Comics for about 6 years, returning in Doctor Strange issue number 61 in 1974 with what was in effect believed to have been the death of Dracula at the time, and then following that, vanished entirely from Marvel Comics until you got to 1990. Now, the funny thing about Blade's return came with kind of Tomb of Dracula Volume 2 when it was issues 2 through 4. There wasn't a whole lot doing here outside of the fact that everybody was convinced he was crazy and he ended up in a mental institution. The reality here is that Dan Chichester in 1992 had basically brought back Blade in what was in effect a wholesale rework of the supernatural and mythological side of Marvel Comics. And that's one of the things to know. When it comes to different sides of Marvel, really only one part of Marvel has remained intact since its inception, and that's the traditional role of superheroes, right? Good guys fighting bad guys. So like the role of the Fantastic Four, the role of Spider-Man or the X-Men or something like that. Different threats have emerged over the years regarding those characters, but by and large, since their introduction, they haven't really changed all that much. And a lot of it was because seminal stories involving those characters took place in the early days of their publication history, which set the stage for what they were about, right? Like the introduction of the Sinister Six in Spider-Man Annual number 1. When it came to the supernatural side of Marvel, it was just kind of like, whatever. And so the way this played out is that over the course of Blade's publication history, what you saw was a coming together of Blade alongside two other guys, Frank Drake and Hannibal King. And the way these characters operated is that in the early 1990s, Marvel introduced a group called Borderline Investigations. So what these guys did is they essentially investigated things that dealt with like vampires and so on and so forth. It was a way to take the characters of Blade and Frank and Hannibal and give them more of a purposeful role in Marvel Comics, because up to that point, they were just kind of running around in these individual books, hunting vampires, things like that. Now, one of the cool things here is that this was part of a larger story that would introduce what we know as the Midnight Suns. And so that's why if you ever look up Marvel Comics, you'll see two groups. You'll see the Midnight Suns composed of the Night Stalkers and then basically everybody else. But the whole idea behind this was, again, a reworking of the supernatural mythos of Marvel. And so this era of Blade's history is as much a kind of reworking of Blade as it is the supernatural stuff. And so within this era of storytelling, this kind of Night Stalkers comic book run, that in Night Stalkers number 1, which is when Blade really made his return after all these years, that he took on the appearance that we most commonly see with this character, right? The leather jacket or the black leather jacket and all that kind of stuff. But the larger story here dealt with the return or the emergence of a woman by the name of Lilith, who was literally like the mother of demons. And so this whole thing regarding like Frank and Hannibal and Blade being brought back together again, the idea of like Morbius and Ghost Rider and so on and so forth, all those individuals coming together was actually done at the manipulation of Doctor Strange in order to bring them together to have them essentially overcome the forces of Lilith. And so that's why you ended up seeing things like the Midnight Massacre, stuff like that, where Blade got his hands on the Darkhold, believing it could be used to destroy the occult, all the while not realizing that the purpose behind this is that that individual who used the Darkhold would basically become the new demigorge, so essentially a kind of god among gods, but would be under the control of Chthon the whole time. So in effect, Blade using the Darkhold would quite literally lead to Chthon returning to Earth. Ultimately, of course, he was stopped and the day was saved and that kind of thing. But that really, that kind of discussion goes largely into the nature of the Midnight Suns more than it simply does focusing on Blade. And so while I am kind of skimming through his time as part of the Midnight Suns and the Night Stalkers, just because of the fact that, again, that's really more of a discussion about the nature of the Midnight Suns themselves. One of the things that I do want to point out here is there were some very significant moments that came out of this comic book run, specifically the Night Stalkers themselves themselves and the larger role that played with Blade, in the sense that Blade, as we know him now, really began to take form during Night Stalkers. Now, one of the funny things about this is that a lot of the Night Stalkers' origin is really told in hindsight, which is to say that during this time when Blade was basically missing, that it was Doctor Strange that had kind of manipulated things behind the scenes, that you had Drake and you had these guys who were operating as borderline investigations, but that kind of took place off panel. And that once the team really came back around and effectively reformed, it was Doctor Strange manipulating things to ensure that group reformed, and that they would run into the other individuals that would make up the larger Midnight Suns team in order to face off against Lilith. But Marvel, of course, did this because Blade was considered such an outlier in Marvel that rolling him in with Doctor Strange, or having Doctor Strange kind of incorporate that group in there, brought them closer in line with quote-unquote main Marvel comics as a whole, and really made the team more, I guess, relatable or acceptable by the general reader base that wasn't really looking to read anything that was considered fringe. The issue that you had with Blade at this point in time, at least following the whole Night Stalkers cancellation and everything, is that when it came to him showing back up on the scene in Marvel Comics in the early 1990s, and you had him forming the Night Stalkers along with Frank and Hannibal, and then you had the really them joining in with everybody else and forming the loose-knit group, the Midnight Suns, is that with this story arc, it was done for a particular purpose. But once Lilith and her Lilin were defeated, there wasn't really a way to tell a compelling story with Blade, because you were kind of back to square one with, what do we do with this guy who's hunting vampires and his real major nemesis is Deacon Frost? That story was wrapped up in the old Tomb of Dracula stories. The Dracula himself kind of comes around every once in a while, but at this point in time in the 1990s, nobody really wanted to see comics where Blade was fighting Dracula, because by this point, so much work had been done with so many other superheroes that was just exceedingly basic storytelling. That with Chris Claremont and the X-Men, what you had was like a soap opera featuring the X-Men. It was very character driven. The Fantastic Four were now a multiversal exploration team, that when it came to groups like the Avengers, they had these massive spacefaring escapades in addition to all the stories on Earth. Then you got Blade fighting Dracula. It just didn't stick. And so while you did get stories like Blade Vampire Hunter issues 1 through 10 by Ian Edginton, or you had stories like Blade Crescent City Blues, at the end of the day, you also had the comic bust of the mid-1990s, right? We kind of talked about that in the past, about how fans were buying comics thinking they would just increase in value forever, which led to Marvel and DC publishing more of those comics, which drove down the value, because now you had like 15 copies of like an issue number 1 of a comic book. That the result of this is that people just stopped buying comics, so Marvel started going belly up. And what this meant is that Marvel stopped publishing stories, or at least hiring the best writers and best artists for stories, if they didn't think they were bankable. And so Blade, going from the mid to the late 1990s, was quite literally a reflection of superheroes that were suffering under the comic bust of the 1990s. You can track Blade by that. His stories weren't compelling, they weren't overly interesting, they were intriguing for what they were, but unless you were a big-time Blade fan, you couldn't really get anything out of it. The result of this is that Blade fell completely and almost totally into obscurity, with the exception of only those fans who love supernatural stuff. But all that changed when the Blade film came out. Now, the interesting thing about this is that, as most of you guys know from the Blade film, he's a daywalker, right? He can walk around in broad daylight, basically, even though he's a vampire, and kill vampires while they're sleeping. It's one of the most menacing aspects of his character as far as vampires go. In the comics, he didn't become a daywalker until around this same time as well. Now, that happened in Peter Parker's Spider-Man issues 7 and 8, when he was bitten by Michael Morbius. And because of the nature of Michael Morbius's vampirism, right, being a living vampire, that this spread to Eric Brooks. And it wasn't until you got to the newly relaunched Blade issue number 1 that you actually saw him operating as a daywalker, realizing the full extent of what the bite of Michael Morbius did and allowing him to walk around in the daytime. But there isn't really a clear-cut explanation here as to which one came first. Is it one of those things where, because the Blade film was going to focus on him being a daywalker, that the events of Peter Parker's Spider-Man number 7 and 8 were basically done in order to coincide with the film, or if the comics were already fleshed out and the film copied the comics? We don't really know, and we don't have a full-fleshed explanation there. What we do know, however, is whether it was because of the film or the comic, following the film and the comic, Blade went forward as a vampire that could walk around in broad daylight. And what this did is it opened up a host of new possibilities for what Marvel could do, because the alternative was to have him running around at night, killing vampires where he found him, and like, that was it. By allowing him to operate during the day, it meant he could function when other superheroes were functioning. And because he could do that, now there was ample room for team-ups. And so what you saw here following 1999 in Peter Parker Spider-Man issues 7 and 8, as well as the Blade film, was just this explosion of appearances in Blade in all these different comic books where it never happened before. Now, the other part of this is that because the movie was so popular, Marvel just threw them everywhere, right? They put them all over the place. And people ate it up because the general person out there who had never heard of Blade had gone to see this movie with Wesley Snipes being the big name draw and was like, who the hell is Blade? Ran to the local comic book store and suddenly there was Blade all over the place. And so while Marvel did relaunch Blade Vampire Hunter as Blade Volume 2, it was canceled shortly after because it was the same problem that it always was with Blade. Marvel didn't know how to write a good story about him. Really, one of the things to know about his character, what makes Blade intriguing isn't so much himself, it's the circumstances that he's in and the teams that he's a part of that makes him interesting. On his own, he's just a guy who hunts vampires. And while for some people that may be a really intriguing element of his character, for most people, it wasn't. And so that's why when you got Blade Volume 3, which was basically a Marvel Max line, that story was really, really cool, but that story dealt with a group called the Trikes, or Tricks, or whatever you want to call them, which were essentially the Marvel Comics adaptation of the Reapers from Blade 2. It was interesting for what it was, but unless you saw Blade 2, you didn't really care. And so it's one of those weird and wonky situations for a character that doesn't resonate. But again, he had some interesting stories. For example, Blade Volume 4 basically dealt with him being sent back in time by Dr. Doom. He ultimately ended up coming, or at least saving the life of his father, only to find out that his father was aware of a prophecy to essentially resurrect Dracula, to return vampire souls to their bodies, making them invulnerable. That Blade ended up having to kill his own friend Hannibal, different things along those lines. But again, it didn't necessarily resonate too much. However, it's not to say that there was never anything beneficial about this guy. Again, we're kind of running short on time here, so sort of fast tracking a little bit. Kind of giving you guys the highlights. One of the more interesting moments that came with Blade in really recent memory actually came out of Mighty Avengers. Now, this is Mighty Avengers Volume 2. The first Mighty Avengers actually was led by Carol Danvers, was part of the original Civil War event, or really the aftermath of Civil War, where she was kind of like the long arm of the law, so to speak, where she essentially operated to apprehend any superheroes out there who refused to register after Civil War was over and the bad guys essentially won, right? Like registration was the law of the land. With Mighty Avengers Volume 2, this actually came really sprungboard off of Jonathan Hickman's Infinity and like Thanos and the Cold Obsidian showing up and like Ebony Maw tricking Doctor Strange or kind of forcing Doctor Strange to summon Shumagorath to this plane of existence and so on and so forth. Blade showed up here and he was actually donning the moniker of Ronin. And depending on who you are as a Blade fan, people love that. And indeed, that's probably one of the cooler moments of his character when he was operating as a version of Ronin in Marvel Comics. It was pretty solid. But for the most part right now in Marvel Comics, and as it really has been for a number of years, Blade's just kind of there. He's just a guy who's there and Marvel tells stories about him sometimes, and sometimes they're interesting, sometimes they're not. At the moment right now, he is on Jason Aaron's Avengers team. How long that's gonna last, I don't entirely know. You can bet your bottom dollar when the movie comes out, he's gonna get his own comic, if he hasn't already. He's gonna get his own comic book out there, and I'm sure people are probably gonna read it for a little while, but the real test here, the real question is, can a compelling story be written about Blade? Because he is, at the end of the day, a phenomenal superhero. He has a really, really intriguing backstory, but he never really has any stories that you're actually interested in reading. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. I'm sorry all the Blade fans out there. I don't mean to smash on the guy. It's just, I think it's important to make sure that people look at Blade in perspective. But we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.